This training includes on-screen sign language interpreting and captioning. Audio description is incorporated into the manner in which the training is presented.
Welcome to the U.S. Access Board training on the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, also referred to as PROAG. My name is Juliet Schultz, and I am the Transportation Systems Engineer here at the Access Board. Presenting with me will be Scott Windley, who is a Senior Accessibility Specialist with the Access Board. On August 8th, 2023, the U.S. Access Board issued its final rule on the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, PROAG. This training will present PROAG in 4 training modules: Rulemaking History, a highlight of changes to the proposed rule, and Chapter 1 will be presented in this first module. The next 3 modules will address Chapters 2, 3, and 4, respectively. The Access Board began developing accessibility guidelines for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way shortly after the ADA was enacted in 1990. In 1992, the board issued proposed guidelines for state and local government facilities, including pedestrian facilities in the right-of-way, followed by interim guidelines in 1994. In response to the proposed and interim guidelines, the board received numerous public comments that indicated that there was a need for further outreach, education, and research on accessible pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way. In 1998, the board issued its first final guidelines for state and local government facilities without the public right-of-way requirements due to concerns expressed through public comments. At its May 1999 meeting, the Access Board voted to reinitiate rulemaking on accessible pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way by convening a federal advisory committee to develop recommendations for guidelines for public rights-of-way covered by the ADA and the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968. Committee members represented the diverse interests of those affected by this rulemaking, including people with disabilities, federal, state, and local public works and transportation agencies, as well as organizations representing design professionals, pedestrian and bicycle organizations, standard-setting organizations, and organizations representing the access and needs of individuals with disabilities. In 2001, the advisory committee presented its consensus recommendations to the board. Their report addressed a variety of facilities in the public right-of-way and identified the features of each facility not adequately addressed by ADAG. Based on the advisory committee's recommendations, the Access Board developed draft accessibility guidelines for pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way, which it made available for public review and comment in 2002. In November 2005, the board released draft guidelines for purposes of gathering information for a cost analysis. In March 2011, the board issued an advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, ANPRM, on supplement for shared use paths for public comment. July of that year, the board issued a notice of proposed rulemaking for public comment. And in February 2013, the board issued a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, which added requirements for shared use paths. The board carefully reviewed all public comments received in response to both the NPRM and the SNPRM. A summary of comments and major issues raised by commenters can be found in the final rule preamble discussion. We consulted with the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and other federal agencies in revising the proposed text, and have now issued the finalized guidelines on accessible pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way. For those of you familiar with the NPRM and the SNPRM, you will notice the following changes to the rule text. The board concurred with commenters that incorporating MUTCD provisions by reference did not provide sufficient clarity for a mandatory standard. The MUTCD includes text under headings of standard, guidance, option, and support. Referencing MUTCD text under the heading of option, for example, made it unclear as to what PROAG was mandating. The board no longer publishes advisories in the Code of Federal Regulations, as the information contained in those advisories is guidance, not mandatory requirements. The board has clarified that newly constructed pedestrian facilities are those that are constructed on greenfield. Any pedestrian facilities or elements that are constructed on or added to developed land are subject to the requirements for alterations described in R202. Upon consideration of public comments, the Access Board acknowledged the diverse nature of alterations that affect pedestrian signals and declined in the final guidelines to list specific actions that trigger the requirement to install APS, accessible pedestrian signals. For consistency with the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines, which express slope only in ratios, in the final rule, slopes are expressed both in ratios and percentages. The practical effect of this change is that slopes stated as 2% in the proposed rule are now stated as 1 in 48 or 2.1% in the final rule. 1 in 48 is the ratio used in the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. Due to significant commenter response, the board also added visual contrast requirements at stair treads and and landings. We will address these changes from the proposed text in further detail throughout the training modules. Starting with Chapter 1. Chapter 1 of the Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines addresses the application and administration of the rule. Chapter 1 includes the following provisions: R101, purpose and application; R102, deviations from these guidelines; R103, conventions; and R104, definitions. Where a public right-of-way is part of a site covered by the ABA or Title II of the ADA, these guidelines apply to the public right-of-way portion of that site. These guidelines contain scoping and technical requirements to ensure that pedestrian facilities located in the public right-of-way are readily accessible to and usable by pedestrians with disabilities. Both ADA and ABA covered facilities required by regulations issued by federal agencies under the ADA or ABA must comply with these requirements. Provision R102 was previously titled Equivalent Facilitation, and it allowed that under the ADA, the use of alternative designs, products, or technologies that result in substantially equivalent or greater accessibility and usability than the proposed guidelines are permitted. The board has added language clarifying that the use of alternative designs, products, or technologies is not permitted for facilities subject to the ABA. The board has also added a provision at R102.2 explaining that under the ABA, deviations from an enforceable standard issued by GSA, HUD, DOD, or USPS require an approved waiver or modification, which is issued by the standard setting agency upon a determination that the waiver or modification is clearly necessary. While commenters requested that we provide a list of specific tolerances, it would not be beneficial to codify specific tolerances in these guidelines that cannot be easily updated when revised by industry. You'll notice in the final rule, dimensions are stated as having a specific minimum or maximum endpoint are considered a range. That has not changed from the proposed rule. As mentioned in the summary of changes in the proposed rule, Slope measurements were stated only in percentages, which in most cases had been rounded to whole numbers. For consistency with the ADA and the ABA accessibility guidelines, which express slope only in ratios, in the final rule, slopes are expressed in both ratios and percentages. The board has elected to state percentages to 1 decimal place for ease of implementation, as current digital measuring tools commonly used in sidewalk construction typically provide measurements to 1 decimal place. So for example, cross slope is specified as 1 in 48 or 2.1%. Conventions provision R103.2. This sub-provision for the calculation of percentages was revised for clarity, but the basic requirement remains the same. So where the required number of elements of facilities to be provided is determined by calculations of ratios or percentages, and remainders or fractions result, the next greater whole number of such elements or facilities must be provided. So for example, if a group of 5 benches is provided at a location that is not at a transit stop or transit shelter, PROAG requires 50% of those benches to meet accessible design requirements. 50% of 5 is 2.5, therefore 3 benches are required to comply. The sub-provision for the units of measurement has been edited slightly to clarify that ratios and percentages may not be exact equivalents, and each must be used independently of the other. Measurements are still stated in US customary units and metric units, and the values in each system must be used independently of each other. Because the rule no longer incorporates the MUTCD by reference, the relative terms in MUTCD have been added to the rule text. Several other defined terms have been added for clarity in light of revisions to the rule. Before we go into the list of definitions, I want to highlight a few definition edits for those familiar with the proposed rule. We removed vertical surface discontinuities and is now addressed this concept as changes in level. That is consistent with ADAG. We added a definition for block perimeter to clarify on-street parking requirements. We also added a definition for boarding platform to distinguish between transit stops that must have detectable warning surfaces from those that do not have to have detectable warning surfaces. In the final rule, we have also added a definition for crosswalk, which replaces the phrase pedestrian street crossing that was used in the proposed rule. On this slide, the new definitions are accessible pedestrian signal and boarding platform. Accessible pedestrian signal is a definition from the MUTCD. The definitions for accessible, alteration, and blended transition were revised for clarity. In editing the definition for alteration, the board wanted to emphasize the distinction between alterations and new construction. We added an accompanying definition for the term developed. So an alteration is a change to or an addition to a pedestrian facility in an existing developed public right-of-way that affects or could affect pedestrian access, circulation, or usability. Boarding platform is a term that was added to help clarify which transit vehicle boarding and alighting areas must have detectable warning surfaces. So boarding platform is a platform raised above standard curb height used for transit vehicle boarding and alighting. Standard curb height is specific to each jurisdiction. Based on numerous technical assistance inquiries, the board decided to add a definition for block perimeter, which is also illustrated on this slide. So a block perimeter definition is the near side of the streets surrounding a block. For example, on a square block bounded by Main Street to the south, Pine Street to the north, First Street to the east, and Second Street to the west, the block perimeter includes the north side of Main Street, the south side of Pine Street, the west side of First Street, and the east side of Second Street. This definition of block perimeter is used in the scoping of accessible on-street parking specifically in the public right-of-way. The definition of crosswalk was added from the MUTCD with minimal edits for clarity. Commenters suggested and the board concurred that where applicable, PROAG rule text language should align with established industry terminology. The word crosswalk, as I mentioned earlier, is used in the final text where the proposed text used the phrase pedestrian street crossing. With the exception of the word curb, all definitions on this slide were retained from the proposed rule and only edited minimally for clarity or consistency with the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines as applicable. Cross slope was edited for consistency with the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. Curb line and curb ramp were edited for clarity in light of the rule text language revisions. A frequently asked technical assistance question that we sought to resolve with the definition of curb ramp is the distinction between a curb ramp and a ramp. Curb ramps are a distinct feature with specific technical requirements, and ramps are a distinct feature with specific technical requirements. The curb ramp technical requirements can be found in Chapter 3, whereas ramp technical requirements are in Chapter 4. Detectable warning surfaces are a standardized surface with specific technical requirements to warn pedestrians of hazardous areas. The definition of detectable warning surfaces was added in alignment with it being defined in the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. The word developed, as I mentioned earlier, is an added definition that serves the purpose in the final rule of distinguishing areas of new construction versus alterations. The term grade is synonymous with running slope. And lastly, the term grade break was previously defined in the proposed rule and now edited slightly for clarity. The terms highway and median were derived from the MUTCD with minor edits for clarity as applicable to PROAG. Operable part was previously defined in the proposed rule and edited for clarity in the final rule. The terms parallel curb ramp as well as perpendicular curb ramp, which you'll see in a couple of slides, were both added for clarity. In the proposed text, the meaning of these terms was implied through technical specifications. Inquiries we received in technical assistance indicated that the structure of defining by technical specifications was confusing. So for clarity, we have explicitly defined both parallel curb ramp and perpendicular curb ramp in the final rule. The definition for passenger loading zone was added to qualify in the rule text which passenger loading areas are covered by these guidelines. So a passenger loading zone is an area that is specifically designed or designated for loading and unloading passengers, but does not primarily serve vehicles on a fixed or scheduled route. The definition for pedestrian was derived from MUTCD with minor edits for clarity as it applies to PROAG. The definition for pedestrian access route was edited to add the word accessible for clarity. So pedestrian access route is now defined as an accessible, continuous, and unobstructed path of travel for use by pedestrians with disabilities within a pedestrian circulation path. Pedestrian activated warning devices is a new phrase defined in the final rule text. These are devices that are installed in conjunction with the warning sign and are activated to alert vehicle operators to the presence of a pedestrian, such as rectangular rapid flashing beacons. Pedestrian change interval and pedestrian hybrid beacon are both terms from the MUTCD. It was necessary, like mentioned before, that these terms and others in the final rule text are added because we have included pertinent requirements from MUTCD directly into the rule text. Pedestrian circulation path was previously defined in the proposed text and now edited slightly for clarity. Pedestrian facility is a new term, and it denotes a structure, route, or space for pedestrian circulation or use located in the public right-of-way. Pedestrian refuge island is a new term that helps in clarifying the size of pedestrian refuge area where detectable warning surfaces are required. So a pedestrian refuge island is a defined area 72 inches long minimum in the direction of pedestrian travel, located between traffic lanes for pedestrian refuge within a median, splitter island, or channelizing island. Pedestrian signal head is a term from the MUTCD. As mentioned with parallel curb ramps, the definition for perpendicular curb ramps was added for clarity. Public right-of-way was previously defined in the proposed rule, and the definition has been retained without edits. Both push button and push button locator tone are definitions from MUTCD that have been incorporated in the final rule text to support the MUTCD requirements that are now also explicitly stated in the final rule. Qualified historic building or facility was previously defined in the proposed text and slightly edited in final rule to align with the way it's defined in ADAG. In the proposed rule text, we did not define ramp. Based on technical assistance inquiries, the Access Board decided to add a definition for ramp to mitigate some of the confusion between a ramp and a curb ramp. As you can see, the last sentence in the definition of ramp states a curb ramp is not a ramp. The definition of roadway comes from MUTCD with modification for PROAG. The definition of roundabout also comes from MUTCD. Running slope was previously defined in the proposed rule and edited in the final rule for consistency with the changes in the final rule. Shared use path was previously defined. It has been edited to account for authorized users other than bicyclists and pedestrians. The definition for sidewalk and splitter island both come from MUTCD. We added a definition for stair, in part to make the distinction between a curb that might require a curb cut and stairs that may need to meet applicable accessible design requirements. We added a definition for standard curb height to clarify the requirement for detectable warning surfaces at boarding platform. We also added a definition for transit shelter and a definition for transit stop to clarify which transportation facilities are covered by PROAG. You will notice that in the last sentence in the definition for transit stop, it clarifies that this definition does not include intercity rail except where a stop is located in the public right-of-way. In the proposed rule, transitional segments was a provision. In the final rule, we defined transitional segments and use that terminology in different parts of the rule text. The concept of transitional segment has not changed. The definitions of traveled way and walk interval are from the MUTCD. We added a definition for vibrotactile to clarify requirements for accessible pedestrian push-button features. This concludes the first training module of the finalized public right-of-way accessibility guidelines. For questions on this module, you can email row@access-board.gov. Join us next for Chapter 2 of the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines Final Rule training modules.